myself. All right. The psalm for today is Psalm 106. I'll just read a few verses. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is gracious. His mercy endures forever. Who can express the noble acts of the Lord or show forth all his praise? Blessed are those that keep judgment and do righteousness. Remember me, O Lord, according to the favor that you bear for your people. Visit me with your salvation. This is the word of the Lord. So today we're going to talk about the period after the English Civil War, and we'll draw a little bit on some themes from John Milton, but I'll introduce King Charles II and talk about what happens in England. And we'll introduce one of, I don't think this is the greatest thing in English literature, but it's one of my favorites. This is one of the books that I sort of started reading early on. And I think I read it when I was in 7th or 8th grade. So it's a lot more accessible than Shakespeare is. And some things I assign, not because it's the best book. Paradise Lost is considered to be the best book. But this is the most influential book. Like millions more people have read Pilgrim's Progress than have read Paradise Lost. And so if you want to think about, if you want something that you can read and understand the changing character of the Western South, this is pretty good. It's passing out of our imagination, which for me is really sad. I very rarely hear people in your generation refer to it. My grandparents' generation talked about this book all the time. The way that you casually drop comments about Captain America and Thor and Loki, like that's a part of your imaginative universe. Christian and Apollyon and The House Beautiful and Vanity Fair are just core parts of the imagination of my grandparents' generation. So this is one of those books that's like Dante, like lots of people haven't read it anymore, but if you want to have intelligent conversations about where you come from, this book's good. And the nice thing is compared to basically everything else we read in the course, it's pretty easy, right? It's not hard to understand once you take it apart. So, all right, let me say a word about Milton, just because I feel like we did short shrift to Milton. I know we talked a lot about the devil, because once we start talking about the devil, it gets really exciting. But one of the other things in Milton that we'll refer to a great deal is the way that Milton understands the human person. We spent a lot of time on Hobbes, and if I could go back, I'd probably cut a couple chapters of Hobbes and spend a whole day on book 3 of Milton. In book 3, the devil has sort of been thrown out of heaven, and God and Jesus and the angels are gathered before the throne, and they're debating what are we going to do about the devil's rebellion, because it seems like it's just marching forward. It's honestly not as beautiful as the description of the devil, because I think our attempts to make God glorious always inevitably fall flat. So from a literary standpoint, yeah, maybe a B+. But philosophically, what he does here is really, really interesting. And so I want to draw your attention to the way that God describes the human person. God knows ahead of time everything that's going to happen. So he sketches out for the angels this picture of the devil's going to rebel, and he's going to tempt Eve, and Eve is going to fall, and then there's going to be this desolation all across the human race, which is a deep theological problem then. Because if God knows that we are going to sin, are we responsible for our sins? What do you think? This is kind of a 300-level theology question, but you haven't had that class yet. But what do you think?
Well, there's still the part of the human nature in which we have free will.
Right.
So regardless of if God knows that there is sin in the world,
Right.
It's still our responsibility to take our own actions.
Yeah. This is what Milton's going to say, and this is why I want to hit this note really clearly, because the other major voices we're reading from this period don't really give people a lot of agency. So Calvin and Hobbes. That's close. Hobbes is a determinist, right? He thinks that everything is determined by material stimuli, and he doesn't really think the human creature has a lot of free will. He puts the human rat in the maze and he knows that the rat is going to go and eat the cheese. It's just like, right? And the other book, the book that we're reading this week, is Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Well, Bunyan is a Calvinist and he believes that God is totally sovereign. And so he doesn't really think that man has much free will either, right? So this is a bit of a deceptive because it seems like nobody from this particular century believes in free will. And so I need to draw your attention to this passage from Milton because Milton believes in free will and freedom of conscience. And lots of people from this century did. It's just sort of an accident of what I've chosen. So this is in the book 3 section. I don't expect you to have it right in front of you, but you might take some notes on the line and you can go and look it up. God has this foreknowledge. He knows, and he's describing Satan here, for man will hearken to his glozing lies and easily transgress the sole command, sole pledge of his obedience. So will fall he and his faithless progeny. So that's the problem. Man's going to fall. The devil's going to get him. I know it. Whose fault? Well, whose but his own? Ingrate he had of me all he could have. It's a strange thing. Like he's calling man ungrateful and he's barely created him. It's like he's blaming him for something he hasn't done yet. That bothers us. But this is God. And what does he say about this person? He says, ingrate, he had of me all he could have. I made him just and right, sufficient to have stood, though free to fall. Such I created all the ethereal powers and spirits, both them that stood and them who failed. Freely they who stood, and fell, who fell. What's he saying there? God gives every spirit free will. All of the angels have free will. Lucifer has free will. Adam has free will. Eve has free will. And he knows that some of the creatures will fall and others won't. But everyone was made with this capacity to resist. Does that make sense? And the battle then that we get in the, and I won't recreate it for the sake of time, but this is Milton's picture of who we are. And at our best, we have this capacity to choose good. And this is why Milton believes in freedom of religion. God wants everyone to make a choice. And that choice is the essence of what we were created to have. And so if the state chooses for you, or the government chooses for you, is the government following the will of God? No, God wants people to freely choose him. And the choice is best and most perfect if it's unconstrained. And so God wants you to have the freedom to make this choice. This is a religious argument for religious freedom, not a secular argument. The Enlightenment justifications for religious freedom will come later as people stop believing in religion quite as much. But the initial people fighting the hardest for religious freedom are all religious because they believe that we have free will. Okay. Now, this is not quite John Bunyan. The Milton Bunyan contrast should be large in your mind because Milton is the most educated man of his day. And Bunyan is, I don't know, what level do you think this is written at? Is this written at like the graduate level or the college level or the high school or 8th grade or?
Like everyday person.
Yeah. Yeah, and what's really remarkable is that we can read it and mostly understand it, even though it was written 350 years ago. I mean, this is pretty good. Yeah, it's remarkably accessible. And when you read an old book that's really readable, that's a signal that it's really important because our language has actually been shaped by this book. And so the words in the book haven't really become archaic. You could read other books from this time period, maybe Robinson Crusoe, and see much the same thing, but you could read other plays from the same period that people forgot about, and that language has sort of slipped away from our vocabulary. So part of the reason it's accessible is because it is what it is. Okay. Let me give you a bit of backstory on the Reconstruction period, and then Restoration, and then we'll talk about Bunyan himself. the dates of Cromwell's government go from 1649, when the king was killed, to 1660, when when Oliver Cromwell's son dies, and they recognize they need to bring the king back. So in 1660, Parliament invites the king to come back. And it's this delicate dance because the king can never forget what happened to his father. He's never going to give people that much freedom. But at the same time, he can never forget what happened to his father, right? What happens if you push English people too hard? They're going to kill you. Like, this is a place where revolution actually might succeed. Unlike, say, Poland or France or Russia, where like there'd never been a successful revolution. So the king has this sort of really delicate problem with how does he put England back together? England is too fractured and too fragmented and too diverse. So between 1660 and 1688, Charles and his brother, James, rule as kings of England. James is only king for like 2 years of that, so it's almost all Charles. Charles, remember, was trained by Hobbes. He's had a brilliant education, but he sort of appreciates that he needs to be a Protestant king in order to keep everything together. He was raised in Paris. He's good friends with the King of France. In fact, most English people don't know this, but the King of France is paying him a secret kind of annual bribe. How would you feel if you found out that Joe Biden was making $20 million a year from the Chinese? And in exchange for that, Biden was gonna like give them all of these favorable concessions. This is exactly what Charles is doing for his entire, he's actually secretly on the take from the King of France, and nobody knows. And a part of this is that he will, when he gets the opportunity, convert to Catholicism and make England Catholic again. So this is like, he doesn't want religious freedom. He wants to keep everyone in an Anglican church so that someday he can bring it back into the Catholic fold. He never manages to do this. So he passes a series of laws governing people's religion. The most important of these is the Act of Uniformity. This is a tricky thing. Do you guys know this? I read from this. This is my Psalter, right? So that there's a psalm every day. But this is the Book of Common Prayer, which at this point had been around for a long time. But they do another revision of it, and they don't change the theology, but they carefully change all of the prayers. And in order to be a good Christian in England, what they say is, we're not going to tell you what to believe, because we will kill each other if we do that. But this is the only acceptable way in which you can worship. So if you're going to a worship service and they're not praying these prayers, you're breaking the law. Or if you give money to support a pastor who's not praying these prayers, you're breaking the law. And more specifically, there are sermons that must be read on the king's birthday, or on the memorial of his father's martyrdom, they called it. It's like there's a tight set of controls on whether or not, and part of this is that you have to accept the supremacy of the king as the head of the English church, which is a big deal. There's a terrible day, it's called Black Bartholomew's Day, because it happened on St. Bartholomew's Day. In 1662, they enforced this. And on that day, 2,000 pastors are kicked out of the church in England. There are about 8,000 parish priests. So about a quarter of the clergy refuses to take the oath of supremacy, and they basically lose their jobs. They get fired. So that gives you a sense of like how divided England is. About 3/4 of people are like, yep, we're going to do this. The Catholics are a persecuted minority, but the king sort of stops persecuting Catholics because he's secretly Catholic. And so the people who bear the brunt of the restoration are actually a lot of your ancestors. They are Baptists and Presbyterians and Congregationalists and Quakers, and lots of people then who come to the United States, which by this point is being settled, are people who come fleeing from this kind of persecution. Because if you get thrown out of the church in England, you can come to Massachusetts or you can come to New York. And so that's part of why people come to America. That's not enough to persuade the king that they're going to be safe. So there are two more laws that are passed to actually make sure that the religious dissent is silenced. Because think about it, what happens? Imagine that you're a pastor, right? So we'll say Bethany is a pastor, and she has been, you've lost your license, you've lost your right to preach. But what do you know? What are you going to do with your life? I mean, what else can you do? All you know how to do is preach. So what happened is like, well, I'm just going to go start my own church, right? So hundreds of people do this. And this is not what the king had in mind. So the king passes another act. It's called the Conventicle Act. Conventicle is one of these words that actually isn't in Pilgrim's Progress, and so we don't use it anymore. But it's basically, it's against the law to meet in a private meeting with more than 5 people who are not in your family, unless you have some kind of royal permission. So like, what happens if you're a group of scientists and want to work on a lab project? I mean, some of you might actually appreciate this. If you're in a lab group of 10 people, like suddenly it's against the law, right? We would say, well, we are a group of people and we're meeting in a class and we have permission from the state. It's like, this is legal. But what if you wanted to have a private club, like Ultimate Frisbee Club? Under this law, they'd be like, no. So this is a kind of police state move, right? Lots of people didn't like it. But it's because they're really, really worried about the threat of religious freedom. Now, eventually they come to realize that this is unenforceable and that's dangerous. So they pass a third act called the 5 Mile Act. And what it meant was that people could not go and start their own church if it was within 5 miles of an official Anglican church. And that basically meant that there could be no churches but Anglican churches in most of England. I mean, think about it. Imagine if you needed to start a Methodist or Wesleyan church here, and you couldn't start it within 5 miles of a Methodist or Wesleyan church. So like, not within 5 miles of Fillmore, not within 5 miles of Houghton, not within 5 miles of Canada, not within 5 miles of Belfast, because there's a little Methodist church everywhere. So, and remember, this is before cars, and poor people don't have horses. So basically, this is a way to kind of completely control religion in England. And how did the people feel about this? Remember that like the Puritans won the Civil War, and they tried to reorganize England on biblical principles, and now they're out of power. And they're not popular now. They're not well loved or well remembered. So this group emerges from England. They're really important because they're the forebearers of lots of American religious folks, but especially John Wesley's mother, Susanna Wesley, was in this group. They were called nonconformists because they didn't subscribe to the Act of Uniformity, and they tried to practice their faith as they could, and that meant that they were sometimes going to secret churches. What did they actually believe? This is a group of people that tended to be roughly Calvinist, but there's now a sort of belief in freedom of religion, and so there's increasing diversity between them. So here's like a few basic points on what this group of people believe. They're really important because they're important to the settling of America, and they're also really important to the scientific revolution. So like we're talking about Isaac Newton's family here. We're talking about John Locke's family here. We're talking about John Wesley's family here. Lots of important Englishmen fell into this position. So this is a group of people who believed in the idea of conversion, that was the important thing that made you a Christian, not necessarily being baptized in the English church. Now, they believed in baptism. They thought it was really important, but baptism wasn't sufficient to make you a Christian. Second, they increasingly believed what Galileo had emphasized, that the world of nature and that the world of grace were different places. And that one might live in the world of nature and develop a business and make a fair amount of money or study it scientifically, but that the world of grace or the celestial city was a different place. And so the spiritual or theological impulse that would get you into the heavenly city was different than the sort of things we did here on this earth Now, third, that the saints were supposed to exercise a great deal of self-discipline. So many of these people were very poor, but they weren't, how do I say it? This isn't a group of really lazy poor people. This is a group of poor people who were kind of freaked, I guess I would say. They're anxious about whether or not they're saved or whether or not they're going to heaven. And so the Apostle Paul says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And these are people who are like scared and they're working hard to see if they're going to make it. Milton actually says this about Oliver Cromwell. It's part of the reason he admires him so much. Milton says of Cromwell, he could conquer the world because he had first conquered himself. So these are a group of people for whom self-discipline is really hard. They tend to live in really rural areas. They tend to be frightened of the state. What's the ultimate authority for these people now? One of the questions I asked you about on your, like, not everyone got the same essay for the exam, but like one of the questions, I don't remember which class I gave which essay. I asked about the crisis of authority and how traditional sources of authority were being smashed, right? And a lot of you were thinking about how the self or the individual is now a major source of authority in the modern world. There's one traditional source of authority that survives and even becomes more important than it ever had been because all the other sources are being smashed. Do you know what it is? Yeah?
Is this the Bible?
It's the Bible, yeah. So the Bible is this ancient source of authority that Protestants believed was like the only thing you could trust. So we see this in Bunyan. Like, he doesn't cite ancient sources. He doesn't cite the classics. He's not a very educated man. He knows nothing about science, but like literally every paragraph is loaded with references to the only thing that he knows is true, which is just the Bible. And that's a feature of this kind of grassroots thinking for another 2 or 3 centuries and has a deep impact on something like hope. That's not the way people in the Middle Ages thought, remember. Like, they believed in the Bible, but they believed the Bible had to be synthesized with all these other sources of truth. Whereas for John Bunyan, there's only one thing that's true in this world, and it's the Bible. And that's a new way of looking at the world. It's a radical way of looking at the world. 3 more things. These separatists, these Christians had a new view of the church, that we needed a pure church, an uncontaminated church, and not a secular church. So up until this moment, all of the different Christianities that have been fighting against each other all thought that they were the true church, and that if they became successful, they would take over the government and they would make everyone follow them, right? So the Catholics want to conquer Europe and make everyone Catholic. The Lutherans want to conquer Europe and make everyone Lutheran. And this is the first group of kind of religious dissenters who said, you know, if we get power, we're not actually going to do that again. This is a major idea for the foundation of America. There's a separation of church and state, that they're not the same thing. And so this freedom to worship is so important that if we were ever going to be in a place where we got power, we wouldn't do this. And Pennsylvania is one of the first places where you see this, or Rhode Island. A lot of the American colonies are founded on this principle. This is a point 6, a really fragmented group of people, John Bunyan's people, and they don't actually all agree. There are Baptists, there are Quakers, there are Presbyterians, there are Congregationalists. Like churches in America today, there's like no one. And in England today, like the main church is the Anglican Church. But if you were to try and figure out, well, what's the second most popular church? It's like, there's just dozens of different varieties. It's hard to nail down. America's like that too. You know, it's really hard. Our largest denomination is the Roman Catholicism. And then, but if you're not Catholic, like it's Protestantism, it's really hard to analyze. And we owe this to the nonconformists. And then number 7, and this is a bit controversial. You need this to understand Pilgrim's Progress. These people, like I think lots of American Protestants today, are kind of wildly apocalyptic. They expect that the world is about to end, that God is going to come back and judge everything. And because of that, there's an urgency to the message. We get this in the first few pages of Pilgrim's Progress. Everything is about to be put to smash. The world is coming to an end. People get ready. And the thing that you have to do in this environment is nurture your conscience, watch your conscience. And this is the world into which John Bunyan is born. And in some ways, this is, if you're an American, we still live in this world, right? We're now living in a theological world that's pretty familiar, right? All right, questions on that? That takes us down to everything but Bunyan. Comments? I'm not describing Europe as a whole. I'm describing an English peculiarity that, because England then settles the United States, is also an American peculiarity. But these peculiarities are going to become really important to us in the course in the next 6 weeks. And this is why. There are 3 countries in early modern history that do something really dramatic, and they diverge. They develop a political and economic system that's unique, that doesn't do what the rest of Europe does, that develops a set of political freedoms that are far beyond what continental Europe permits. And then that's where you see the creation of capitalism, the creation of modern states. And in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, these are the countries that come to dominate and form world empires. We're talking about the Dutch, the English, and the United States of America. So we're still going to talk about the rest of the world. This is still like a Western history course, but this is something I'm personally really fascinated by. Like, why is it that these countries diverge? And I'm going to call it the Great Divergence. These countries just, they start growing in power and scientific knowledge a lot faster than the rest of Europe. And it's strange. And the question is why? And some scholars think that this peculiar religious minority might have a lot to do with it. These anxious, hardworking, Bunyans. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Bunyan. Bunyan was and this is an old word we don't use anymore. Bunyan was a tinker. T-I-N-K-E-R. Do you know what that is? His father was a tinker too, because he lived in a world where one didn't choose one's occupation, one did exactly what one's dad did. Something I'm really thankful for, because my grandfather was an Amish farmer, and I'm really happy not to be an Amish farmer. So it's nice to live in a world where I get to forge my own career path. But what's a tinker? Yeah?
Don't they work with like metal and stuff?
Yeah, really good. That's kind of a, yeah, that's advanced. But they're not like blacksmiths.
Yeah, they
Um,
have, like almost like sheet metal. More like.
Yeah, that's right. If you had a pot that developed a hole in it after 100 years, it would be too expensive to throw away. And a tinker would fix it for you. Yeah, so these are people who become really important a century later as part of the Industrial Revolution. But at this point in time, they're like lower middle class. They don't have a lot of wealth. They don't have a lot of status. They're literate. So they read a little bit and write a little bit. And so that puts them way above average in England. But these are people without much status. The rich look down on them. He becomes a soldier at the age of 16. And when he's 16, we can do the math. He's 16 in 1642, which is when the Civil War gets roaring. So he joins Cromwell's New Model Army. And we don't know very much about him because he's just in the rank and file and he fights in the battles and he distinguishes himself, but he's not like a brilliant military genius, so he doesn't become an officer. And that seems to be the defining aspect of his life. He moves back to Middle England, to Bedford, where he has, he gets married, they have kids, he's pretty poor. He has 2 Puritan books in his library at home, and maybe a dozen other books in his community that he can read. So he wrote this with very little else besides the Bible and like small scale Puritan theology books. He is a man who's profoundly affected and conscious. When I told you Luther's story, I told you about like how Luther was really conscious of the fact that he was a sinner and spent like 10 years in the Catholic Church trying to find freedom from that guilt. Bunyan is the same sort of man. His defining years, when he's your age, he's in the army, he's fighting, he's swearing, he's cursing, he's killing people, and he's like, he sort of has this sense that he needs to give it all up. So he has this profound religious experience, becomes a lay pastor, which in Cromwell's years is no big deal. And then what do you think happens to lay pastors or lay preachers when the king comes back to power? What does Charles do with not even licensed preachers who don't believe his theology, but like unlicensed preachers? This starts to happen a lot. People have these consciences, and like, I mean, what would happen if one day I decided, you know what? God has got a new purpose for my life. And I mean, as much fun as it is teaching y'all, like, this isn't what God has for me. God wants me to go save the lost and tell people about Jesus. So I quit my job and I go down to Route 19 and I start waving my Bible around and yelling at the cars as they pass by. Now, that would look a little strange today, but it would be against the law in England, right? They don't want unlicensed pastors. And it's not just, think about it, you understand this world. It's not just that the theology is wrong, even if I had exactly right theology. Let me ask you a question. If you were going to draw up a real estate contract, would you want an unlicensed lawyer? Or even crazier, my son had appendicitis last year, and we spent like a month in Oshai getting his appendix removed and healing him up. Should I hire an unlicensed physician to do the operation? Oh, no. Like, so that, and yet we don't think twice about having an unlicensed pastor preach. Like, they'll ask me to preach in chapel at some point. Like, I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't have any kind of like, but that's sort of this world that we live in. In these days, if you were an unlicensed pastor, people would be like, that's dangerous. Like, just like an unlicensed doctor might kill my son. An unlicensed minister might lead you straight to hell. So Bunyan is really radical. They put him in jail, right? And he's in a little bit of trouble, not under Cromwell, and he just won't shut up. He's in there in this particular moment in time. It wasn't the government's job to feed you if you were put in prison. Your family still had to feed you, and he has a wife and kids. So he's literally, his wife would smuggle him these threads, and he would weave the threads together to make shoelaces, and they would sell the shoelaces so that they could feed their family while he was in prison. Like, he's living at a really low level. He's really charismatic. All he has to do is say, all right, I don't believe this stuff anymore, and they're going to let him out of jail. But he won't give up because he thinks his conscience is right. So he writes this book from prison. It's published in 1678. It's an immediate smash hit. He's referred to for the last 20 years of his life as Bishop Bunyan, not by the church, but by ordinary people for whom his influence is enormous. There are 100,000 copies of this book in print by 1692. And this is a book, again, where there's censorships, like it's being printed in Holland and it's being printed in Geneva and it's being printed illegally. This is an enormously influential story. Some call it the Summa Theologica of evangelicalism. I mean, this is the book that helped ordinary people think about the faith. There is a part 2. You'll notice, like, one of the most objectionable things about the whole book is Christian's attitude toward his family, right? He's callous. And that bothered people, and it bothered Bunyan. So there's a part 2 of the book. It's nowhere near as good as part 1, but it's like this sort of sequel that he had to write because people were really angry. Like, they demanded another. And part 2 of the book explains how his wife becomes Christiana and also becomes a Christian. They'd have to get the rest of his family to heaven. It's like, there's a sequel. I've read it. It kind of stinks. It's like nowhere near as spectacular. This is really, really good. In order to make sense of it and why it blew people's minds, you have to remember 3 things, and then we'll start the text. Okay, 1, novels don't exist yet. So most writing is either like Galileo or like Milton. And the kind of fantastic stories are generally written as epic poems. He doesn't have the ability to write an epic poem. So he puts his epic, but this really is an epic poem, if you think about it. Like, in his style, and particularly poetry is driven by image. if you read this like it's an epic poem and don't focus on the words, but focus on the pictures, the word pictures that are painted, it'll make a lot more sense to you. So yeah, this is written in a world without a novel. And a lot of scholars say that it's really difficult to imagine even like an early modern adventure novel, like something like Robinson Crusoe, without this book making those kinds of stories popular. Because what is a Robinson Crusoe but a kind of secular adventure story that's a lot like this religious frame, right? There's also stuff like Montaigne, right? Montaigne's description of, but Montaigne is kind of like, he's strange. That's definitely not a novel. The second thing is like, yeah, everything is religious in this age. So like we are really struck by the religiosity of the story, but that's really normal to them because like almost everything that would be in print would have that kind of religious frame. That's not what really struck the people. The people read this story as a revolutionary tract by people outside of power criticizing the status quo. So just think about like the image that we get in this first section, right? We've got our character named Christian. Where does Christian live? We given much of a picture of his home setting. Where does he live? It's not named, but feels like a small town in England, right? And he lives there with, again, ordinary people, his wife, his kids, his friends, the tradespeople. And we learn really early on what's going to happen to this town. It's going to be destroyed completely and utterly. So you pick up this book and you read it, and it's about your England and how your England is going to be completely and utterly destroyed. So this book is more like a Left Behind kind of thing. Like it's not just an abstraction. It's like it's set in a real time, a real place, and it's kind of like, okay, this is, I'm really stretching, but I want to light up your imagination so that as you read this, if you have fun with it, it's like Christian horror. Like your family's going to die. You're going to die. The destroyer is coming for you. And so in that sense, it's not only political. Well, let's unpack the politics of that. Now, should that happen in Christian England? Because England's traditional picture of itself is we are Christendom. And we are protected by bishops and people who pray for us. And the King of England is himself the head of the church. So yeah, when Jesus comes back, he's going to pat the king on the back and say, hey, good job, Chuck. You know, nice job with England. Thanks for keeping it Christian for me. Like that's the gospel according to King Charles, right? And Bunyan is sketching another world in which no English person is going to be saved from the fire that's coming, because basically no one in England is Christian. Like, and we feel that as a theological move, but that's political. Do you get what you like? This is dangerous. This is radical. There's a reason he's in jail. Like this is sedition. Okay, and then the third way that you have to read this as being wildly fantastic. Like read this like sci-fi, because there are these, or like, again, I don't know if you're Doctor Who fans, but like my kids are sort of into that at this point in time. Like this is like that space where the boundary between the bizarre alien and the ordinary people is just sort of walking down the streets of London, and suddenly these monsters come out of the sewer, and he's describing the real world as being like that, where these fantastic, horrible things are just right around the corner, and the barriers between this traditional world of nature and this spectacular world of horror and grace is just right around the corner. And you're never quite sure when things are gonna. And if you read it with an eye to that, like nothing like this exists. There is no Marvel, there is no Captain America, there is no Spider-Man. And so this really lit people's imaginations up. And it in a way that sort of really annoyed the church, because they didn't have anything to counter this. This was hard to resist. Yeah, that's enough monologuing from me. Questions? I want to start in on this a little bit so that you get a feel for how to read it. And we'll do most of our heavy lifting in the next two classes. Let's turn to the first page. And just see how far we can get today. So this is page 13. If you don't have your books, you should bring them to class next time. I see that your books actually don't look like mine. You've got mine. Okay, you've got it. Okay, we're good. Yeah, page 13. As I walked through the wilderness of this world, I alighted on a certain place where was a den. A den is just the word for prison, right? If it were Johnny Cash, he would be singing about Folsom Prison. Like this is literal. I, John Bunyan, was walking through the wilderness of this world, and I was in jail, and I laid down and I slept. And this is the dream that I had. So he's presenting this to you as if it's true, not as a sort of fantastic, poetic, fictional thing. Yeah. People who read the Iliad and people who read Virgil sort of had a sense that it was mythology, and he's not making that move. He's not telling you this is mythology. He's saying, hey, I actually had this dream. And part of it's because he's a simple, ordinary guy. He doesn't have that level of fancy. Okay. So now let's talk about what he sees. I saw a man clothed with rags, standing in a certain place with his face from his own house, book in hand, and a great burden on his back. I looked and saw him open the book and read, and as he read, he wept and trembled, being able longer to contain. He broke out with a lamentable crying, saying, "What shall I do? What shall I do?" Okay, let's interpret that. What does that mean? Who is the pilgrim? Yeah.
I mean, like, I guess when I read it, it kind of gives an illusion of Jesus. Like,
Okay.
I kind of picture like the cross on his back and like
Okay.
kind of the burden
Okay.
of having to die. Like,
Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah, this is good. Like, there's like, this is exactly how you're supposed to read it. You're supposed to read it and say, okay, this thing represents this thing represents this thing. I'm not sure I don't think he's Jesus, but you're reading it correctly. It's like, this is the way that you're supposed to approach it. It's not like reading Virgil where you'll be like, I don't understand these references. I can't do this because I don't have a classical education. I've never taken humanities 101. I don't know what to do with this. Like, this assumes you know nothing. Yeah.
he represents us. He represents
Yeah. Nice. So this is every man, right? And then we sort of, what's the book? The book is the Bible, right? It doesn't like, this is a new way of reading literature. Whereas like, if you read Dante and there's a book, the book would represent 4 or 5 different things and it would have a layered meaning. And there would be sort of what an ordinary person would understand. And then there were like, Dante's like wheels within wheels within wheels. This is just straight up. The book is the Bible. The book is only the Bible. It can only be the Bible. And there's nothing more to it. So stop, like, just, that's it. Good job, right? This is actually nice to read because it's easier than most of what you've done at Houghton so far. Okay, what's the burden on his back? It's sin, right? This overwhelming sense of guilt, this thing that he can't get off his back. And why is he crying? He doesn't know what to do. He's stuck. He's paralyzed, right? So that right there in like 20 lines is everything it took us it took us 45 minutes to do this in Hobbes, right? Hobbes sort of gives us this really detailed picture of the human person in chapters 1 through chapter 10. And here we get it in. So what is the human person like? What? We are fearful creatures. Yes. Yes. Why are we afraid? It's not far off, actually. The parallels to Hobbes are here. Yeah, we're scared of God. We're scared of this greater power. We're all going to die. And here's where the crucial difference is. What does every man do? What can every man do? Yeah.
Read the Bible.
You can read the Bible. Okay. So the Bible is the beginning of the path to wisdom. There's nothing like the Bible in Hobbes, but if you remember Dante is sort of lost in the dark wood. And Dante's first move is what? Virgil. Virgil shows up. And the classics are Virgil's guide on his beginning to wisdom. There is no classical wisdom here. Like Bunyan would say of Humanities 101, what a stupid thing to teach all of the freshmen. You don't need it. Give them an extra semester of Biv Lit. They'd be better off. This is Bunyan, right? Like the Bible is what you need. Okay, so let's play around with this theology a little bit. Is the Bible enough? What do you learn from the Bible and what can't you get from the Bible? Yeah.
Well, at least from just this little segment that we're shown,
Yeah.
like after like looking into the Bible, it cries out, like,
Yeah.
what else? What else? So
Yeah.
I think that's trying to imply that, like the Bible is like that foundation
Yes.
that you require,
Yes.
but there's more than that that you need. Either
Yeah.
you need that community or you need that
Okay.
connection with someone to help you.
Yeah, and the lost person is completely alone. Yeah, and that loneliness is true for Hobbes and for, go ahead, yeah.
The Bible kind of just opens his eyes to
Yes.
like the problem.
Really
but
good.
He doesn't know what actions to take until he meets the evangelist.
Yeah, so this is it, and this is where you can see his Calvinist theology, right? Yeah, the Bible will help you realize that you're a sinner and you're going to die, but you can't save yourself. And speech and reason for Hobbes are able to equip every man on this path toward, you can start to create for yourself a political savior who will give you freedom. And Bunyan's like, that's garbage. That's not going to happen. Like, you need someone to come. God needs to send someone to help you. And that someone is the evangelist. It's like, we can walk through this really fast. The evangelist is the person who tells you about Jesus. And the evangelist says, head toward the wicker gate. And you then sort of get this really over the top metaphor of the straight and narrow, and like, stay on this road, stay toward heaven. Okay, that's all you need sort of moving forward. Here's what we're going to do for next time. We're going to add to this about 50 pages. You'll read it quick. It will take you an hour. Pay attention to these 4 particular images, because we could focus on any one detail and obsess about the detail and unpack it. So the house of the interpreter, and I want to talk about the slough of the despond from today's reading. Slough of despond, house of the interpreter, the cross, the palace beautiful, and my second favorite passage in this book comes at the end. So make sure you read this. It's awesome. It's where he meets Apollyon, this dragon demon, and it's like, it's straight up horror. It's spectacular. So we've got to talk about that. We've got to talk about that. Yeah, and we'll practice the allegorical interpretation. All right. We'll see you on Wednesday.